They then probed the ground around the cabin with a metal rod, especially in the disturbed soil of the vegetable garden and the orchard, where Dr. York's body was found later that evening. Hello and welcome to Serial Saturday. Today's serial killer is a family, and it is the first serial killer family in America, the Bloody Benders. Let's dive into it. The Bender family, more well known as the Bloody Benders, were a family of serial killers in Labette County, Kansas. The estimates report that the Benders killed at least a dozen travelers and perhaps as many as 20 before they were discovered. The family's fate remains a mystery, with theories ranging from a lynching to an escape. Much folklore and legend surrounds the Benders, making it difficult to separate fact from fiction. In October 1870, 5 families of spiritualists homesteaded in and around the township of Osage, approximately 7 miles northeast of where Cherryville was established 7 months later. One of these families were the Benders. The father and son arrived in October 1870 and registered 160 acres of land located adjacent to the Great Osage Trail, the only open road for traveling farther west. After a cabin, a barn with a corral, and a well were built, Almira, the wife, and Kate, the daughter, arrived in the fall of 1871. The Benders divided their cabin into 2 rooms with a canvas wagon cover. They used the smaller room at the rear for living quarters and the front room as a general store where they sold dry goods. The front section also contained the kitchen and dining table where travelers would stop for a meal or spend the night. Almira and Kate also planted a 2-acre vegetable garden and an apple orchard north of the cabin. That is important. John Bender Sr. was around 63 years old and spoke little English. He was described as, quote, a repulsive old man, hideous brute, without a redeeming trait, dirty, profane, and ill-tempered, end quote. Sounds like a winner. According to the May 23, 1873 edition of the Emporia News, he was identified with the name William Bender as well, so he had an alias. Almira Bender was 59 years old and spoke slightly better English than her husband, but usually was unintelligible. She also went by another name, Elvira Bender. She was described as, quote, a dirty old Dutch crone. Her face was a fit picture of the midnight hag that wove the spell murderous ambition and the soul of Macbeth. She was also described by neighbors as a she-devil. Their son, John Jr., was around 25 years old and handsome, with auburn hair and a mustache. He spoke English fluently, but with a German accent. He was prone to laughing aimlessly, which led many to consider him a half-wit. Well, it was probably a coping mechanism, or a tic. The daughter, Kate, also known as Catherine, who was around 23 years old, was cultivated and attractive, spoke English very well with little accent. A self-proclaimed healer and psychic, she distributed flyers advertising her supernatural powers and her ability to cure illnesses. She also conducted seances and gave lectures on spiritualism, for which she gained notoriety for advocating, quote, free love. Kate's popularity became a large attraction for the Benders Inn. Although the elder Benders kept to themselves, Kate and her brother regularly attended Sunday school in nearby Harmony Grove. According to the author Lee Ralph, the Benders' origin could be traced to Germany and France, eventually arriving in America in the 1870 census, showing John, Almira, John Jr., all born in Germany, whilst Kate was born during a brief stint in France. In May 1871, the body of a man named Jones was discovered in Drum Creek with a cut throat and a crushed skull. The owner of that section of Drum Creek was suspected, but no action was taken against him. In February 1872, 2 more bodies were found with the same injuries as Jones. By 1873, reports of missing people who had passed through the area had become so common that travelers began to avoid the trail. The area was already widely known for horse thieves and villains, and vigilance committees often arrested some of the disappearances only for them to be later released by the authorities. Many innocent men under suspicion were also run out of the county by these committees. In the winter of 1872, George Newton Longcore left Independence, Kansas with his infant daughter, Mary Ann, to resettle in Iowa. They were never seen again. In the spring of 1873, Longcore's former neighbor, Dr. William Henry York, went looking for them and questioned homesteaders along the trail. York reached Fort Scott and on March 9th began the return journey to Independence, but never arrived. York had 2 brothers, Ed York, living in Fort Scott, and Colonel Alexander M. York, a Civil War veteran, lawyer, and a member of the Kansas State Senate from Independence. Both knew of William's travel plans and, when he failed to return, began a search for the missing doctor. Colonel York, leading a company of some 50 men, questioned every traveler along the trail and visited all the area homesteads. On March 28, 1873, Colonel York arrived at the Bender's Inn with a Mr. Johnson, explaining that his brother had gone missing and asked if they had seen him. They admitted Dr. York had stayed with them and suggested the possibility that he had run into trouble with Indians. Colonel York agreed that this was a possibility and remained for dinner. On April 3rd, Colonel York returned to the inn with armed men after learning that a woman had fled the inn after Almira Bender had threatened her with knives. Almira allegedly could not understand English, while the younger Benders denied the claim. When York repeated the claim, Almira became enraged, saying the woman was a witch who had cursed her coffee and ordered the men to leave her home, revealing for the first time that her, quote, sense of the English language was much better than she had let on. Before York left, Kate asked him to return alone the following Friday night, and she would use her clairvoyant abilities to help him find his brother. The men with York were convinced that the Benders and a neighboring family, the Roaches, were guilty and wanted to hang all of them. But York insisted that evidence must be found. Around that time, neighboring communities began to make accusations that the Osage community was responsible for the disappearances and that the Osage Township arranged a meeting in the Harmony Grove schoolhouse. 75 locals attended this meeting, including Colonel York, and possibly both John Bender and John Bender Jr. It is unknown. After discussing the disappearances, including that of William York, they agreed to obtain a warrant to search every homestead between Big Hill Creek and Drum Creek. Despite York's strong suspicion regarding the Benders since his visit several weeks earlier, no one had watched them, and it was not noticed for several days that they had fled. 3 days after the township meeting, Billy Toll was driving cattle past the Bender property when he noticed that the inn was abandoned and that the farm animals were unfed. Toll reported the fact to the township trustee, but due to inclement weather, several days lapsed before the abandonment could be investigated. The township trustee called for volunteers, and several hundred turned out to form a search party that included Colonel York. When the party arrived at the inn, they found the cabin empty of food, clothing, and possessions. A bad odor was noticed and traced to a trap door underneath a bed nailed shut. After opening the trap, the party found clotted blood on the floor of the empty room underneath. They broke up the stone slab floor with sledgehammers but found no bodies, and determined that the smell was from the blood that had soaked into the soil. The men then physically lifted the cabin and moved it to the side to dig underneath it, but no bodies were found. They then probed the ground around the cabin with a metal rod, especially in the disturbed soil of the vegetable garden and the orchard, where Dr. York's body was found later that evening. Buried face down with his feet barely below the surface, the probing continued until midnight, with another 9 suspected grave sites marked before the men were satisfied that they had found all of them and retired for the night. The next morning, another 8 bodies were found in 7 of the 9 suspected graves, while 1 was found in the well, along with several body parts. All but 1 had their heads bashed in with a hammer and their throats cut. The newspapers reported that all were indecently mutilated. The body of a young girl was found with no injuries sufficient to cause of death. It was speculated that she had been strangled or buried alive. A Kansas newspaper reported that the crowd was so incensed after finding the bodies that a friend of the Benders named Brockman, who was among the onlookers, was hung from a beam in the inn until unconscious, revived, interrogated, and then hung again. That's brutal. After the 3rd hanging, they released him. Oh, he didn't die. After the 3rd hanging, they released him and he staggered home, quote, as one who was drunken or deranged. A Roman Catholic prayer book was found in the house with notes inside written in German, which were later translated. The text read, Johanna Bender, born July 30th, 1848. Who was Johanna? And then it says, John Gebhardt came to America on July 1st, 18, question mark, they couldn't read the full date. And then it says, Big Slaughter Day, January 8th. And one other quote in the book was, quote, hell departed. Interesting. Word of the murders spread quickly, and more than 3,000 people, including reporters from as far away as New York City and Chicago, visited the site. The Bender cabin was destroyed by souvenir hunters who took everything, including the bricks that lined the cellar and the stones lining the well. State Senator Alexander York offered a $1,000 reward for the family's arrest. That's equivalent to $26,000 in today's currency. On May 17th, Kansas Governor Thomas A. Osborne offered a $2,000 reward for the apprehension of all 4. That's equivalent to about $52,500. It was deduced that when a guest stayed at the Benders' bed and breakfast inn, the hosts would give the guest a seat of honor at the table that was positioned over a trapdoor into the cellar. With the victim's back to the curtain, Kate would distract the guest while John or his son would come from behind and strike the guest into the side of the head with a hammer. One of the women would then cut the victim's throat to ensure death, and the body was then dropped from the trapdoor. Once in the cellar, the body would be stripped and later buried somewhere on the property, often in the orchard. Although some of the victims were wealthy, others carried very little value, and it was surmised that the Benders had killed them simply for the sheer thrill of it. Testimonies from people who had stayed at the Benders' inn and managed to escape before they could be killed appeared to support the presumed execution method of the Benders. William Pickering said that when he had refused to sit near the wagon cloth because of the stains on it, Kate Bender had threatened him with a knife, whereupon he fled the premises. A Catholic priest, Father Paul Ponzing-Leon, claimed to have seen one of the Bender's men concealing a large hammer, at which point he became uncomfortable and quickly departed, making the excuse that he needed to tend to his horse. However, the priest only claimed to have had an encounter after the Bender's crimes were revealed, making his account unreliable. The Bender family sold stolen goods such as horses and saddles, clothing, and other possessions under the guise that people who had spent the night and were unable to pay would pay with goods. At another time, a Miss Fitz, while sitting at dinner, became uneasy and sensed a muffled movement behind the canvas. Kate issued a command, but before anything could happen, the terrified Fitz fled. Two men who had traveled to the inn to experience Kate Bender's psychic powers stayed for dinner but refused to sit at the table next to the cloth, instead preferring to eat their meal at the main shop counter. Kate then became abusive towards them, and shortly afterwards the Bender men emerged from behind the cloth. At this point, the customers felt uneasy and decided to leave, a move that might have saved their lives. More than a dozen bullet holes were found in the roof and side of the cabin. The media speculated that some of the victims had attempted to fight back after being hit with the hammer. The escape. Detectives following wagon tracks discovered the Bender's wagon abandoned with a starving team of horses, with one of the mares lame just outside the city limits of Thayer, which was 12 miles north of the inn. It was confirmed that the family had bought tickets on the Leavenworth, Lawrence, and Galveston Railroad for Humboldt. At Chanute, John Jr. and Kate left the train and caught the MK and T train south to the terminus in Red River County near Denison, Texas. From there, they traveled to an outlaw colony. Thought to be in the border region between Texas and New Mexico, they were not pursued, as lawmen following outlaws into this region were never seen from again. The elder Benders did not leave the train at Humboldt, but instead continued north to Kansas City, where it is believed they purchased tickets for St. Louis, Missouri. There are many stories of vigilantes catching the Benders and offing them in various ways, but no one ever claimed the rewards, and it is thought that the Benders were searched for the next 50 years or so. In 1884, an elderly man matching John Bender Sr.'s description was arrested in Montana for a murder committed near Salmon, Idaho, where the victim had been killed by a hammer blow on the head. A message requesting positive identification was sent to Cherryville, but the suspect severed his own foot to escape his leg irons and bled to death. By the time a deputy from Cherryville arrived, identification was impossible due to decomposition. Despite the lack of identification, the man's skull was displayed as that of, quote, Pa Bender in a salmon saloon until Prohibition forced its closure in 1920 and the skull disappeared. That is the story of the Bloody Bender family. Tell me what you think in the comments below, and if there's a serial killer or serial killer family that you want me to go over next. Have a great one. Bye!